Bé, molt bon dia a tothom. Moltes gràcies per acompanyar-nos avui a aquest acte de la lliçó inaugural Irla del curs 2021-2022. Gràcies també a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra per acollir-nos una vegada més i gràcies sobretot a la professora de la Porta per la conferència que farà tot seguit sobre els moviments socials davant l'auge del totalitarisme. Estem preocupats, justificadament preocupats, per l'escassa qualitat de les nostres democràcies. Massa sovint se'ns mostren fins i tot indignes d'aquest nom. I massa sovint també ens semblen instruments inadequats per poder fer front als reptes enormes, gegantins, que la història ens planteja ara mateix. Però les possibles alternatives o dreceres que se'ns proposen, marcades pel totalitarisme, pel populisme, per l'abús sistemàtic d'uns poders que vulneren drets i llibertats essencials, no semblen vies de solució, sinó més aviat camins que ens aboquen a més desigualtat, més irracionalitat, més violència i al capdavall més inhumanitat. Per això necessitem renovar la teoria, renovar els instruments de reflexió, renovar l'aparell crític, renovar les eines d'anàlisi i coneixement per enfortir la nostra capacitat de renovar la democràcia i fer-la veritablement útil al servei dels interessos col·lectius. I per això ens convé tenir accés directe a les reflexions de les persones que estan fent aportacions més rellevants en aquesta direcció, com és el cas de la professora de la Porta. La doctora della Porta, sense la pretensió de fer-ne una presentació llarga, sinó molt breu, és una politòloga i sociòloga d'una gran trajectòria acadèmica i d'un ben guanyat reconeixement internacional. Especialista en l'estudi dels moviments socials, també de la corrupció, la violència política i amb diversos treballs també de sociologia política. Ella es doctorà a l'Institut Universitari Europeu, on també imparteix docència i ha estat professora d'aquest centre i la Universitat de Florència. És fundadora i coeditora de la revista acadèmica European Political Science Review. Ha dirigit diversos projectes de recerca, entre ells un intitulat Democracy in Europe and the Mobilization of the Society, finançat per la Comissió Europea, o també ha coordinat el Gruppo di Ricerca sull'Azione Collettiva in Europa. Ha realitzat investigacions a diverses universitats del món i sobre objectes d'estudi també de molts països i ha rebut diversos guardons en reconeixement a la qualitat de les seves aportacions. En general, com consignava, s'ha ocupat de l'anàlisi dels moviments socials generant una important i extensa, nodrida, bibliografia que ha estat el vehicle principal que ens ha permès accedir a la seva obra. Preocupats com estem, com deia, per disposar d'instruments d'anàlisi i d'interpretació de les convulsions socials que desencadenen l'etapa de canvis i de nous reptes que vivim, la Fundació Irla hem volgut demanar a la doctora de la Porta que comparteixi amb nosaltres les seves percepcions, impressions i els resultats de les seves recerques a propòsit, avui especialment, de les amenaces que comporta l'ascens dels autoritarismes. Estem convençuts que les seves aportacions ens resultaran extremadament interessants. Moltes gràcies, doncs, altra vegada a tots vosaltres i, sobretot, moltes gràcies, doctora de la Porta, per acceptar la nostra invitació. Quan vulgui té la paraula.
Gracias a la Fundación Irla. It is a pleasure and an honor to be asked to open the academic year of the Foundation, and it is especially a pleasure to do it in person after the difficult years of the pandemic time. I'm going to address the issues of the development of an authoritarian type of turn, but also trying to see how social movements have resisted this turn and also can contribute to the type of development of our knowledge and reflections that the president of the foundation was mentioning. So the main assumptions in my presentations are that social movements and institutions are in intense interactions with each other, that they strongly influence each other, like in a sort of tango in which each move by progressive movement is followed by transformations in the institutions, but also that their interactions tend to produce permanent transformations, so that we are in an age of increasing authoritarianism, but we are also in an age of resistance to authoritarianism. And this is what I would like to address also in my presentations, looking at how these times have been conceptualized in the political and social sciences, and which type of transformations in social movements from the times immediately before the pandemics to the time we are living today can contribute to the transformations of the society and to this resistance that I put in the title of my presentation. So, yes. Okay. The title is Social Movements, the Rise of Authoritarianism and Its Resistance. And I would like to start by some memories of movements that look very far away because they occupied streets, they protested in public spaces. That is something that we could not see for given the pandemic crisis in the last almost 2 years. But this movement, I think, are important to reflect upon. So in 2019, 50 years after, and so in the anniversary of the Italian hot autumn in 1969, that represented an intense period of protest for social justice and democracy. This 50 years after, protest developed everywhere in the world. So in Lebanon, there was a strong movement calling for democracy and social justice that had involved many young people against a corrupt regime. In Chile, in the same period, there was a protest that was very consequential in getting results that we saw even in the months of the pandemic with the referendums that abrogated Pinochet's old constitutions and the process of developing a new constitutions with elections of citizens who will participate in the process, and the big victory in this of the political parties and citizens group that promoted progressive social rights transformations and so on. The issues that were addressed were issues of justice, but also issues of sovereignty. And this is also very strongly embedded in some of the movements of those hot autumn of 2019. In Hong Kong, there was the peak of a long and intense struggles for getting more autonomy from China. And in Barcelona, there was also a peak of protest after the strong repression during and after the referendum of the 1st of October. And also in Barcelona, there was in these months massive forms of participation. So what did these movements had in common? It was, as we saw in the pictures, in the media, in the movies, in the social media, massive forms of protest with millions of people in the street. And what the images reported was also a strong presence of young people and a strong presence of women among the protesters. There was a very horizontal form of organizations with social media that helped the spreading of the protest, but at the same time that were considered as not sufficient to the mobilizations of the people. So it was a sort of blended protest in which social media provided instruments, but people actually went into the streets. And they used forms of protest that were quite disruptive. So it was a period in which many forms of civil disobedience were used. Direct forms of actions, occupations of streets and important locations. And it was a period in which not only the movements I mentioned were important and using these forms, but also, for instance, the new wave of environmental movement from the Fridays for Future to the Extinction Rebellion forms of protest, and the women that have been, especially in Southern Europe, including Catalonia, including Italy, including the Spanish country, they were all very active, and they were all using forms of visible protest. Also typical of many of these movements is that they started from a spark that in some cases was quite contingent, so sort of triggering events. That in the case of Chile was the increase in transport fare. In the case of Lebanon was an increasing of the tax on internet, but then expanded very quickly, broadening the range of demands to questions that often combine the issues of social justice, the protest against increasing inequalities, and the claim for different forms of citizens' sovereignty. In these different movements, these different claims were differently blended, but what we saw also in the pictures that I showed before was that there was a sort of international solidarity developing and visible in the use of flags of the countries that were more mobilized, also in the other forms of protest. So, for instance, like I showed in the pictures, in Hong Kong, they used the Catalan flag to connect the types of struggles for democratic sovereignty, citizen sovereignty, and social justice. So this also went together with the invention and concerns with innovations in the definitions of this political, social, and civil rights. There was no common global wave of protest, as it's been the case sometimes in the past, but there was a lot of connections between the different movements. And an element that reminds us of the focus also on the authoritarian turn is that all these movements were very heavily repressed. in different forms, in different regimes, but the characteristics of the reaction has been also visible in many pictures of demonstrators, protesters, using peaceful forms of actions and being repressed by the police. And Catalonia is, of course, a case very relevant for these reflections because a democratic movement that used referendums as a main forms of sensibilizations of the public opinion and participation was subject to high degree of repression, both in terms of repressions in the streets and in terms of repressions through the legal system. So if we look at what social sciences what the social sciences considered as terms, concepts that can be useful to reflect on these times of increasing authoritarianism. There are different concepts that I think all bring some grain of truth, some potential contribution to our reflections. First of all, we are in time that many scholars have defined as time of neoliberal capitalism. So in the very beginning of this moment of prevalence of free market, of social protections, the assumptions had been that free market had no concern with civil and political rights, that they would especially develop a sort of libertarian type of political discourse and actions. In his book on post-democracy, Colin Crouch reflected on the effect of liberal capitalism on declining quality of democracy, but still expecting that the main challenge would be especially in terms of social rights. And so the consequences of declining concerns by the states for social rights of the citizens, the effect that this had on democracy. But there is another concept that in fact developed a little bit later, and it is the concept of a backlash. And it points at the fact that neoliberal capitalism, with the reduction of social rights, went also together with a sort of backlash, so of going back on several civic and political rights, so that the lack of social and declining social equalities, the increasing social inequalities, also was connected with the spread of neoconservative, very exclusive type of violence, of racism against migrants, of anti-gender campaigns that were especially visible in cases like the United States under Trump, Brazil under Bolsonaro, Italy with Salvini in power, and the Lega being more and more a party of the backlash, let's say. We saw criminalizations of solidarity. So while in the past there has been a selective inclusion of many organizations that supported solidarities, especially on the issues of the search and rescue activities in the Mediterranean, there have been actions of criminalizations of NGOs and civil society organizations that have affected not only the most horizontal and emergent group, but also the most established and well-respected organizations like Doctors Without Borders and others. And it was a refusal of civil societies that reminded of the cynicism of capitalism that Polanyi had mentioned in the past. It was a sort of interregnum. It was what a philosopher and political leader, Antonio Gramsci, in Italy called a moment in which the old society is dying and the new society is not born yet. And it is a moment in which, according to Gramsci, morbid symptoms appear. So a quite challenging and dangerous moment, because this interregnum can also create what Gramsci called monsters. And it is a state of emergency, according to many research in political science that looked especially at the developments during the austerity crisis. One of the consequences of the crisis of capitalism and emergencies has been centralizations of decisions, often in the hands of so-called experts, but taken away from the control of the citizens, of reduced transparencies, and also to a large extent of the denial of the very existence of democratic choices. So under the motto, there is no alternative, very often this type of state of emergencies have proclaimed that only the technocratic leadership can find the only right solutions. So this, I think, is a complex syndrome that, of course, developed in different forms in different countries, because I think it would be a mistake to consider that all countries moved in the same directions. These are general trends, but in many countries, the resistance to this trend has transformed the very natures of the challenge, and reduced the impact. And the type of parties in government were, of course, important. And I don't want to be too optimistic, but the defeat of Trump in the United States also testifies of a capacity of people, citizens, to resist to this trend. We still have to see what will happen, but the Black Lives Matter protest just a few months before the elections, I think, have been very important in promoting this resistance. So I will go quickly with the next slide. It is a time of neoliberalism. So it is a time of what an important thinker, Karl Polanyi, in his reflections on great transformations, called dominant, characterized by the dominance of the market over the social, a sort of amoral visions of the societies with the competitions of all against all, a reductions of the citizens' rights that scholars like Marshall had put at the center of the development of democracy. What he says is also they are very ideological time, but ideological in the sense that neoliberalism as ideologies have promoted the market without considering the effect, with an illusions of a separation between the state and the market, because in reality neoliberal capitalism has been promoted by a turn to the right of in several countries, and especially in some most powerful countries. This has produced also political effect in what I've called in some work crisis of responsibility. So the neoliberalism in practice has meant that the states have, and governments at different levels have given up their capacity to intervene for citizens' rights, and through privatizations, deregulations, and so on, they have lost the capacity to support a vision of social protections and solidarity. It's a crisis of legitimacy, but I don't want to go in that. But this is what I want to mention in the second part of my presentation. It is a time also of chances for resistance. So usually social movement studies had considered resistance or social movements in general as more likely when there are more political opportunities, an opening up of political opportunities and resources for the social movements. In reality, what we saw, not only now, but since the financial crisis of the early years 2010, has been the development of movements that challenged increasing threats and increasing risks, and also reacted to a decline of resources for social movement to mobilize. So when trying to explaining these mobilizations against expectations of social and political scientists, I think we have to consider the specific characteristics of sort of critical junctures, on a moment of sudden changes that are challenging the everyday life of the individuals. It is a case that has been addressed for the anti-austerity protest, so the 15 de Mayo movement in Spain, but also the broad protest that spread, especially in countries that were most hit by the financial crisis, and that responded to the grievances that emerged from disruption of everyday habits and rights. And in this sense, these are times that have been considered in the social and political sciences as different from normal times in terms of the capacity of agency of the people, in terms of the importance of contingent type of transformations, and open-ended in the sense that being time of intense transformations, they also are their consequences are difficult to predict. So they are open-ended. And in fact, if we look and take the example of the struggle for independence in Catalonia, and we look from the very beginning, we see a series of contingent turning points related to often moments of repressions, but also ideas about forms of actions like the widespread referendums of independence that have transformed the very ways in which people felt about sovereignty and their especially availability to mobilize. And in these cases, I think we have also to reverse a bit our traditional way to look at movements as consequences of political and social structures and see the capacity of some forms of protest of producing changes, so producing oppositional networks, identifications in actions, the capacity also to transform institutions. And once again, Catalonia is an important example of the ways in which movements that had developed out of the threat of the financial crisis and the challenges of a very authoritarian moves by the Spanish state to also develop forms of transformations of the institutions themselves through the development of movement parties, through the development of new forms of participations, and through the development, as I mentioned, of forms of direct democracies like the referendums. So I want to reflect upon this capacity of movements to transform things, also reflecting on nowadays movements, or at least what we saw in the pandemic times, that were in fact examples of times characterized by strong challenges that the virus put on the capacity and the possibilities for the people to protest. Against the odds, against the expectations, what we saw as scholars studying social movements is that the pandemic times did not stop social movements, did stop to a certain extent the capacity to mobilize in the street, but all those type of energies and ideas that had developed during the previous waves have sort of fueled the capacity of citizens for solidarity type of reactions. So this is a citation from the introductions of the special issues of Interface, a journal on social movements, that in the very first months of the pandemics wrote, the editors wrote, "The world is on fire with both fever and flame. After a few months of lockdown, things are erupting in new ways. Around the world, movements are strategizing about how to ensure that no one is left behind." So what we saw was a lot of protest on issues that were all the more important during the pandemic, and that became sort of symbolically also important as symbols of the type of society we want to develop after the pandemic. And the protest for public health, the protest by the workers in the public health system became symbol for a call of a return of responsibility of politics for the well-being of the citizens. There were protests for workers' rights. In particular, there was a sort of reversal of considerations of which are the fundamental activities in our society, who are the essential works, who are the workers that kept our life possible during the time of the pandemics. And this created a sort of discursive opportunities and possibilities for workers like riders, drivers, workers in grocery stores, and so on, to reverse an image of themselves as just precarious and irrelevant workers, and to stress the fundamental importance of actions of the work of these categories. There was also a connection very strongly made between the climate crisis and the pandemic crisis, with the mobilizations also of Fridays for Future. This is the fourth global strike for climate that had to take place during the hard time of the lockdowns. But nevertheless, activists invented ways to present their claims. And there were protests also for democracy. So in general, progressive movements tended to accept that in order to protect public lives and the life especially of some groups of people, it was important to accept rules of social distancing, lockdown in some cases and so on, but they wanted to have a say on this, and especially in countries where democracy was already of lower qualities or there was no democratic development, protests for democratic decisions, transparency and so on. This is a demonstrations in Ljubljana developed notwithstanding all the constraints. In India, in Brazil, the people went into the street to protect an idea of social solidarity, but also of the need for participation. So what do we have in this type of movement? Is this a new wave of movement? Is this a wave that can promote the resistance to those authoritarian turns? We don't know yet. We know that elections that were held in different countries during the pandemic seem to indicate that the type of deep challenges that the pandemic brought about pushed more citizens to vote for progressive type of parties. This was the case in Norway, in Germany, in the local elections in Italy, and it seems to a certain extent that right-wing populism has been on the losing side, even though it is for sure not defeated yet, and we don't know how this open-ended process will develop. But for sure, we had innovative forms of protest. So we had an adaptation to the constraints on the possibilities to go into the street, through the development of sort of blended forms of protest, using also the internet, but often combining it with symbolic forms of presence in the streets, flash mobs, distanced form, grassroots strike, distanced forms of march, like the one I just showed. Now it is the moment in which movements are going back into the street. What we observed in our research is that in the first moment of return of the movements in the street, for instance, last year with the Black Lives Matter movements, the effect of the constraints on the possibility to move also had an interesting results in making the local actions more relevant. So people didn't move to big demonstrations in the capitals, but participated a lot through sit-ins and small actions of protest near to where they lived. And so it was also a form of reappropriation of the public spaces. What was also very relevant is that these forms of solidarities that had been quite important during the anti-austerity protest with the development of self-help groups, very horizontal forms of mutual help, and forms of solidarities that wanted to detach themselves from the idea of charity and moving instead towards a more politicized frames, spread a lot. And often they spread from very horizontal and very small groups that just organized at the neighbor level to help the neighbor in material needs, but also spreads through the capacity of these forms of connections, ties through the people, also to provide for psychological forms of support, reconstitute ties. So, for instance, the use of balconies or of windows during the lockdown has been studied also in terms of the capacity of politicizing the domestic space in public forms and creating ties of solidarity through the musics, through the slogans, through the symbols that often was then photographed and put on the social media. And this moment proved to be also very capable of producing intense forms of emotions and identifications with people that were living next to us, but that very often we didn't know at all. And during the pandemics, it was an occasion to feel proximate. And another thing that the President also mentioned, important in this moment of interregnum, is the development of knowledge, is understanding faced to very intense challenges and new situations, how we can transform deeply our societies. And social movements, in fact, all over the world, developed a lot what I called the productions of alternative knowledge. They worked in counter-informations, denouncing the unequal effects of the pandemics, hitting especially people at the more poor ethnic minorities and so on. They worked denouncing firms that didn't want to implement security measures, but also in the productions of ideas. And the interesting things that we noticed was that the pandemic facilitated coalition buildings between movements active on different issues. People locked inside the house were paradoxically more able to connect at the global level through the new technologies, and so also to try to put together knowledge that had been developed by the environmental movement, the labor movement, the feminist movements, that was put together in reflections on concepts, for instance, like caring or intersectional reactions and so on. So the last 5 minutes. No? That was too quick? Okay. It means that some other slides disappeared, but I can just use the last few minutes to summarize what I wanted to say in these slides. So, as I mentioned, we are in times that are times of challenges, but also times of resistance. So, threats and opportunities, in which we have to see the nature of the threats, but also the emerging capacity of progressive social movements to resist these threats. We have to reflect about what is the pandemic COVID-19 a case of, as political science said. So, which are similar forms of a phenomenon in the past, which type of consequences they have. And I think the pandemic COVID-19 is for sure what neo-institutional political scientists called a critical juncture, so a moment of abrupt and radical change. It is a critical juncture that develop upon an emergency, and that so implies also very specific political type of responses. And this is a crisis that is linked to an airborne contagious disease that scholars in sociology and in medicine alike characterized as implying very specific type of social developments. So fear of the others, tendency to distancing yourself, potential scapegoating of some groups. But at the same time, I think what historically we have learned is that these times of catastrophe, times of emergency critical junctures, could also be time in which progressive transformations act, not automatically, but on the basis of the capacity of this trigger to produce grievances in a large part of the populations, empowering claims. So if I've suffered and I have participated in creating solutions to the crisis as a citizen, I want to count more also in the future. So these are also times that can mobilize, can create common shared identities as an effect of these increasing solidarities. And we have some examples in the past. After the Spanish flu, it was called in this way, after the First World War, the Spanish flu was called as the pandemic that created the public health system, because of the recognitions of the importance of mobilizing resources to protect the societies. After wars, often we have pushed for reform. Charles Tilly, with an important influence in reflections of broad transformations in societies, famously said, states make wars, but wars make states. So wars very often were important in different steps of democratizations, because the people mobilized then for the war then claimed right. And also other catastrophe, typhoon, earthquakes, and so on, showed the capacity of people for creating solidarity. So even reminding myself and in general that these are open-ended times in which many different actors are struggling for different solutions. I think that's the times of authoritarianism are at the moment being resisted, at times with success, and so that the crisis could also create resources for progressive transformations. And we are here to see how things will evolve and to participate in them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ara obrirem el torn per si voleu fer alguna consideració o teniu alguna pregunta per la doctora de la Porta. Alguna consideració d'algú que vulgui trencar el gel?
Well, I will break the ice myself. I think one of the major problems that social movements confront is the massive concentration of power in media. I mean, very few corporations control what the people see in television and hear in the radio and so on. And it's very difficult for social movements to alter social perceptions on that basis. Not only because of the answers, but also because of the questions, because people may be worried about burglars entering into their houses, when actually the main problem may be that the bank expels them from their houses. So I will ask, do you know or do you notice any case of success of social movements, any special techniques, so to speak, in terms of overcoming this problem of media concentration?
This is a very important question, in particular in the pandemic, that has been defined also as very much related with... Now? Yes. I repeat. No, I think it's a very important question, especially in the pandemic moment, that according to scholars who started to analyze the use of the media, is characterized by a very high use by the citizens of mainstream media just to get information about the development of the virus and so on. And it is a very challenging moment because the pandemic per se produces fear, and this is a type of emotion that is usually considered as difficult to deal with for social movements that require more hope for the future. It has been also a very scandalistic use of informations because the media wants to sell, and so they focused attentions on the informations that they thought were more likely to bring them attention. And very often the pandemic took over 90% of communication. So the media focused on just one issue, very often without the time to connect it with other more general problems. In this, I think that's what social movements have tried to do, has been to use social media to spread a different view. But social media are not easy to use either. And in fact, one of the issues that had been studied is the fact that for their very nature, many of the social media tend to produce more polarization than deliberation. They are used in a more skilled way by right-wing groups that aims at producing this type of polarization. And so they always are insufficient to spread an idea. What I think is important is to remember some classic studies about media use that says that often mainstream media are not consumed individually, but the meaning is filtered through the ways in which other people with whom we talked about the news and so on react. And so I think that going back to this, what social movements could do is trying also to construct and reconstruct a local type of public sphere. So each time I come back to Catalonia and to Barcelona in particular, what struck me as very positive, especially after the anti-austerity protest, is the fact that one sees in the street a lot of spaces for discussion, small events that occupy or reconquer the public spheres. And I think that this is one of the most important type of reactions to
concerning social movements, do you also see a rise in reactionary social movements that have also transnational dimension and so on? And the second question concerning the relatively optimistic message, do you see signs of translating this progressive potential into politics? And I cannot help but being very ambivalent or confused, if you will, because if you look around the world, in China, you have a strengthening of authoritarianism. In Russia, authoritarianism is flourishing. In the United States, it is likely that Trump will come back. Hopefully not, but it's a probable scenario. In France, the sparkle is Zemmour, that is in the heart of Europe. Together with Le Pen, they make the majority. So I wonder whether you see some signs for this relative optimism at the political level in terms of translation of this progressive potential or not.
Thank you, Camille. I think they are important questions. I didn't want to deny that there are also social movements active on the right, and they are part of what they're defined as the backlash. And in fact, they've been quite skilled in occupying different type of spaces through political parties and also through mobilizations that, even though are very different from the one on the left, still use disruptive forms of actions. And the protest nowadays of conspirationist people against vaccinations, denial of the pandemic, and so on, I think are also part of this type of development of right-wing movements. What I have the impression is that the time in which they were dominant, the backlash seems to be a sort of unavoidable destiny, are to a certain extent over. So if we look, for instance, at Latin America, what we saw was that after the period of left-wing victories in Latin America, there have been Brazil, and then coup d'etat in Bolivia, and then other transformations that seems to indicate that now right-wing politics was dominant there. But what we saw is, for instance, in Chile, a capacity of social movements that, as I mentioned, emerged almost from a banal type of spark, and were able to deeply transform the political life in the countries with also electoral victories. We know in Bolivia, the MAS made a comeback, also recognized some of the previous mistakes. And so I think that it is a complex picture in which you have different trends. In Europe, what we saw is that also at the electoral level, we have some return of a left-wing discourse in the center-left parties in countries like Germany, in which 40% of the new members of parliament are very young and are new. And many of these are promoting a very progressive type of discourse. So there is not the revolutionary transformations in the SPD, but an interesting switch towards attentions to issues of equality, environment, and so on. I think we should also study in the future, because it is too early now, how center-left versus center-right government have reacted to the pandemic, because my impression is that it made also a big difference, not only if we look at the dramatic consequences that leaders like Trump or Bolsonaro brought about in their countries, but also in terms of the final effects of the pandemic, also in terms of economic inequalities and so on. So I would say we don't know it yet, and the challenges are all there. But I think that it was also a bit of a rushing up towards seeing only the challenges in those months in which at the same time Trump won in the United States and Brexit won in the UK. There was the impression that progressive politics was on decline. Now I think that we see in open situations, very harsh conflicts, but also, chances for remobilizations, and we will see. I hope Trump will not be re-elected, but let's see. I know you hope that as well.
Hello, thanks. My name is Gina. I'm a PhD student here. I work with Camille on Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. And I have a question which is not unsimilar to his. So my question is not about left and right wing in politics. It's more about the political system, because what you showed very impressively in this presentation is like we're having a moment, a crisis of lacking political responsibility, and we have the stages of interregnum, if you want to call it like this, and we have those movements, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, maybe also the independence movement of Catalonia, that aim for different systems, so for fundamental transformations of the current political and economic system. And my question would be, you left it a bit open at the end, but to give a prediction or your opinion, what you would say if those movements and their demands can still be met by the current political system. So you mentioned Germany and Chile at the same time. What happened in Germany? We have, let's say, quite left parties at the moment, but they are still not meeting the 1.5-degree global warming goal. It's already known for now, like for sure. They can't achieve what those movements demand. And at the same time, you have those transformations like in Chile, where they come up with direct forms of democracy, direct participation. So would you not say that those movements aim for more fundamental transformations and that they maybe cannot be met by current political representative democracies, but instead we need like a further reaching change?
Yes, it's... sociologists and political scientists are not good at making predictions, so I don't want to predict. But I think that what we know from the past is that social movements often present claims of radical transformations, and they very rarely get those important transformations, but the way in which they produce outcomes is more gradual and can be assessed in a longer-term perspective. So, of course, movements are not the only one to mobilize in these periods, and also all the rhetoric of the green economy is sometimes used to co-opt some language of the environmental movements, but towards a type of society that is for sure not the ones that the activists want to promote. I don't think that the renewal energies per se will transform the ways in which we deal with nature that is more at the core of the claims for Fridays for Future and so on. But I think that's also the capacity of the movements to have more cultural impact has been important. And what I see as promising in these movements is that they mobilize young people. This has been always a problem for some movements that remained trapped in the generation of activists that constituted the first wave of protest without being able to involve the young people. It has been for a period the problems of the environmentalists, the problems of the women's movement. What we saw since 2011 is always new entry of young people, and with the Fridays for Future of people very, very young in the high schools. And I think that this is promising for changes also because research on political socializations pointed at the importance of these formative years in producing resilient type of attitudes. And I think that many transformations can come from these mobilizations from below. Not because you create sort of, let's say, places in which only movements counts. So it's not to deny the importance of politics and the institutions. I think decisions by institutions are very important, but I think that also at the grassroots these decisions are prepared. And these movements now, we have to see, for instance, with Fridays for Future, that is a movement that has suffered a lot from the pandemics because it was very rooted in the schools and the universities. The schools and the universities were closed. It was very skilled in using new media, but the new media and social media alone are not able to recreate solidarity. So I think it's important to see nowadays with the reopening of the possibility to protest, which type of developments these movements will have, and also the capacity to connect the issues of the environment with other issues. For instance, in Italy, the Fridays for Future are participating in many of the labor strikes and labor forms of actions, and are connected also in coalitions with the Ni Una Menos forms of protest. So it's showing a capacity to expand beyond the environmental. In Barcelona, there were the protests on the expansion, against the expansions of the airport, that also are a moment in which different types of claims by different movements tend to converge, and I think that this could also create important occasions for spreading the claims.
Una pregunta més, si els hi sembla. Allà n'hi ha una altra, aquí n'hi ha una també. Fem aquestes dues, si les fan seguides. Two more questions?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. My question is always, when I see this picture that you have very, very well put on the table, my question is always, all this movement and mostly young people in this movement are claiming to the political power, but in this situation of neoliberalism, I think economics and financial economics are being more and more disconnected from political power. So there is a process of disinstitutionalization of some decisions, very important decisions, about our life and our society that are taken in other parts than in politics and in our institutions. So there is a process of weakening the political institutions, but how these all movements, global movements, could act against this process of this institutionalization, because they are itself a kind of also a process. They are itself developing a disenchantment of political institutions. So political institutions are fighting two challenges at the same time: the lack of representation of people claims and the power of economics to function a part of politics. We see that in the, for example, in the politics of health, also in the politics of housing. The speculation of housing in Barcelona is very clear. And the capital is international. Most of the new capital in investing in housing is international. We see that in the problems of budget and taxes in all countries, because rich people are not paying their taxes, and multinationals and so on. Global companies are escaping from paying the taxes. So I think there is a very big challenge here, because how people can fight against that, and while fighting against institutions that we need to control this economic flux of money and power.
Fem l'altra seguida, sí? Tu qüestions tu, Greta, and then you respond if you finish.
Bon dia. Jo potser sóc l'últim graó d'aquesta ciutadania que vostè ha estat parlant. I m'he quedat molt sorpresa de veure que dins de la politologia hi ha científics que busquen recerca, i suposo que aquests darrers anys han estat molt suculents per vostès i han pogut estudiar molt. I per això vostè ens ha donat una explicació tan exhausta i tan preciosa que a mi m'ha meravellat i m'ha obert conceptes. I el que he deduït és que dona una importància a la ciutadania molt rellevant davant de les situacions que hem tingut i que ens hem polititzat. I és cert, això també m'he adonat, i que vostè també se n'ha adonat quan ha vingut. Aleshores, penso que la ciutadania ha passat per sobre la política i que els polítics estan dins de la cursa molt retrasats i s'han de posar a un nivell que siguin capaços d'aportar solucions a totes aquestes situacions. De tal manera que vostè també ha dit que els polítics han de ser progressistes, han de ser joves, que les coses les han de fer bé, i realment quan surt un tipus d'aquesta política o d'aquests polítics, resulta que els neoliberals de qui vostè parla o els de dretes posen pals a les rodes perquè no troben o han sabut reconvertir-se en aquesta situació. I aleshores això fa mal a tota la novedosa aportació d'aquests grups de polítics que fan una política molt progressista i realment bona per a tothom. Vostè què li sembla? Gràcies.
Thank you for both questions. I think they are connected to a certain extent, because it is true that a sort of challenge and paradox is that movements at the same time criticize the institutions, but they need them. So it is also something that I found in my research, and I called it desperately seeking politics. So the fact that when we interviewed activists, they always said, we are disappointed and we criticize the existing institutions, but they say they want to strengthen the different types, forms of political power. And what I've seen, and I wrote a book on innovation from below, I call that political innovation from below, that is also a paradoxical tendency of movements that in the beginning were very critical of institutions, like in the 15 de Mayo, for instance, to move very quickly within the institutions. So to realize that even if you criticize the corruption of both parties, the corruption of institutions in general, but at the same time, there is a recognition that you need to enter into the institutions. And this was to a certain extent unexpected for social movement scholars who saw the 15 de Mayo as the most critical of mistrustful of existing institutions, that the anti-austerity protests were not only in Spain very able, capable of entering institutions through three different channels. One was creation of movement parties or transformations of existing ones. And I think it is interesting also when thinking at other cleavages, like the center-periphery cleavages, so the issues of national sovereignty, that period of social movements are also a period of transformations of existing parties, that conceptions of nationalism changes, that the influx of young people tend also to transform these parties. So I think that it would be wrong, and it was wrong in social movement studies for a period, to conceive of movements as just the alternative to parties. In reality, there is very strict interactions, critical at times, but also extremely relevant for both sides. And so transformations in the party system with different degrees of innovation in existing political parties and through the building of new parties is one of the channels through which also institutions are penetrated by social movement activists. And sometimes when these movement parties are able to achieve power, they are sometimes a frustration for the activists because they realize that many changes are more difficult to implement. But at the same time, I would not underestimate their capacity to introduce slowly some of these changes. Then there have been another trend that we have studied as sort of democratic innovations in which movements have used institutional channels like direct forms of democracy to push existing institutions in different directions. So we have studied a referendum in Italy that was promoted by the anti-austerity movements, and the symbolic aim was the fight against the privatizations of water supply. And the referendum was won by large majority by the progressive forces. It was not implemented yet, so it's also a testimony of the challenges that both of you mentioned. But at the same time, it has produced an important recognitions of the shortcomings of privatizations of public services and so on. And also the referendums on independence, very different cases in Scotland and in Catalonia, but are also examples of ways in which movements participate in institutional forms of politics. And the final one, which I found very relevant, and again we can go back to the example of Chile, is what has been defined as a sort of constitutionalism from below. So one of the elements that emerged already with the financial crisis, and even more nowadays, is that we don't need just small policy reforms, but a change of the reconstitutions of the very basis of democratic life. And that constitutional change that was also relevant in the development of the Catalan independentist movements is of fundamental importance. And it is important not only what is written in the constitutions, but also how a constitution is produced. And here the example of Iceland or Ireland are important because there have been attempts and to a certain extent successful in involving citizens in important constitutional issues on which political parties were too divided or too shy to take a position. So the abortion law and the same-sex marriage in Ireland came from crowdsourced constitutional processes in which citizens were asked in different ways to participate. And research on this type of constitution says that the ways in which constitutions are made, so the participations of citizens in this process, has an important impact on the quality of the constitutions themselves. So constitutions can be more or less progressive in terms of recognitions of citizens' rights, and when citizens participate, many ideas are innovative and progressive ideas may be imported into the constitutional process. The example of Chile will be also important to see to which extent these transformations will have an impact also on the quality of the new constitutions that will emerge. So I see the challenge. I think also the movements have seen the challenge and that the perceptions that in order to change things faced to the suffering of the populations, it was not important just to develop prefiguratively other ideas, but also to actually enter the institutions. And once inside, of course, what emerges is that it is not so easy to implement radical changes, but gradual changes, I think, are possible, and I would not expect the revolutions, but maybe a new reversal of the Polanyi's double movements between free market and social protections could be an outcome. Thank you very much.
Bé, doncs moltes gràcies. Deixin-me reiterar-los l'agraïment inicial per la seva participació i sobretot moltes gràcies a la doctora de la Porta per les seves explicacions tan extremadament fonamentades i tan lúcides. Moltes gràcies. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.